Hello, Petal. How are you today? Thank you very much for coming back for Chapter 2 of The Better Mousetrap, J.W. Wells & Co., Book 5, which we love because they're by Tom Holt. I'm loving all the comments. Thank you very much for the likes. I do appreciate it when you hit the notifications bell, when you share, when you follow, when you like the video. It makes it all worthwhile for me, and that is genuine down to the core of my being, because we've got a lovely, lovely little group who listen to these audiobooks and interact, and it just always brings a big smile to my face. So thank you all very, very much. Right, so we're coming on to Chapter 2, okay, and we've seen Frank Carpenter. Please excuse if my New Zealand accent isn't really on point, but anyway, I digress. Right, try that again. So, Frank Carpenter has been helping out a little bit. We've also met a couple of other characters, and we've seen some dragon slaying. Did you feel sorry for the dragon? I did. I always feel sorry for dragons, even though they'd probably incinerate me if I even looked at them in the wrong tone of voice. You know how it is, but I digress. Let's get on with it, shall we? Chapter 2. After dealing with the Eccleshaw business, Frank Carpenter stepped through a door in a wall in Brierley Hill and came out through an identical door in a builder's hoarding in South London. He closed it behind him, waited as it slowly slid to the ground and rolled itself up, picked it up off the pavement, and tucked it into a small cardboard tube, which he stored away carefully in his inside pocket. Not the most attractive of neighbourhoods, he decided. True, it wasn't one of those districts where you have to look where you're going so you don't slip on a nest of cartridge cases from last night's drive-by shooting, but the security grills on the shop windows and the burnt-out P-Ridge Mercedes suggested that this wasn't a happy environment for a shallow, easy-going hedonist like himself. It certainly wasn't the sort of place where you'd expect to find, but there it was. Just across the road and up a floor, over a chemist's, he noted. How are the mighty fallen, and all that. Mam and Dad ought to see this, he said to himself. Most likely they wouldn't grin or snigger, but they'd feel... what? Closure? A necessary turn of the wheel? Dad, anyway. Mum would probably click her tongue and say, serve them right. Or maybe not. Where they'd gone, something like this, couldn't possibly matter. It'd be like expecting the moon to care whether the Tim Henman made it through to the quarter-finals. Below him, something snuffled, and he felt the soft assault of a wagging tail against his leg. He sighed. He was pretty sure he'd been alone when he folded up the door, but apparently not. Or maybe, not a notion he cared to dwell on, maybe Bobby didn't need the door. They say that dogs will travel hundreds of miles to find their lost masters. Oh well, he said. Bobby, heel. Immediately, the drog sprang out into the road, causing a van driver to burn 10 quid's worth of value off his tyres and brake pads. It reached the opposite pavement, turned around, looked at him, and wagged its tail. Stupid animal. The stenciled black letters in the window above the chemist's read, Tanner and Co. Chartered M. From the way the words were spaced, you could deduce that some of the letters had faded away or peeled off after the M. Frank grinned. The chartered was a nice touch. It was one of those words that the eyes skidded off. Behind a word like that, you instinctively thought, works a boring little man whose services I'll never need and which I couldn't afford in any case. Interest evaporates. Nobody ever lingers in the street looking up and wondering what the M stands for. There was a side door. The stair carpet was frayed, with flat blobs of spent chewing gum fossilised in the pile. At the top of the stairs, Frank faced a glass-panelled door with a bell push and one of those boxes you speak into and wait for it to quack back at you before you're allowed in. Somehow, Frank got the impression that not many of Mr. Tanner's customers were walk-ins off the street. He pressed the button and said, "Hello," the way you do. Nothing happened. He tried again. Silence. He was just about to fish in his pocket for the cardboard tube when the box belched static at him and a female voice said, "Yes?" "I'm here to see Mr. Tanner," he said.
Appointment?
"No,"
Name, please.
Ah, Frank thought. Of course he could always lie, just to get through the door. But from what he'd heard about him, he didn't want to start off with Mr. Tanner leering down at him from the moral high ground, and quite possibly rolling boulders as well. Frank Carpenter, he said.
Frank what?
Carpenter, as in woodwork, or Harrison Ford. Pause. Maybe a little white lie would have been justified after all, but Carpenter wasn't such an uncommon name. Maybe they'd think that... He applied gentle pressure to the door and it opened. He saw a small room with grubby wood chip on the walls and flogged out carpet tiles on the floor. There was a plain chipboard desk in the middle of it, behind which sat the most beautiful girl Frank had ever seen in his life. Ah, he thought, I've come to the right place then. The girl looked at him, eyes like soft blue black holes. He looked down at his shoes and noticed they were splashed with whatever the noxious stuff was that they processed at the EchoShore plant. Oh well, he thought, if it burns holes in the carpet, I don't suppose anybody'll notice. Is that your dog? Inside Frank something growled, but he was a civilised human being, so he nodded. I'd like a word with Mr. Tanner, please, if he's free, he said, as pleasantly as he could. The beautiful girl looked at him, and under his claws he fancied he could feel little dotted lines, like the ones you see drawn on pictures of cows in butchers' shops, to tell you the names of the various cuts and joints. Carpenter, did you say your name was? That's right, Frank Carpenter. Was it possible to read someone's DNA with the naked eye? The girl looked as though she was giving it her best shot. I'll see if he's free, she said, and picked up a phone. Into it she recited his name. There was a long, quiet interval. Then she put the phone back and nodded at the door behind her. He rather got the impression that if the decision had been up to her, he'd be headed out through the other door, or the window. The back office was pretty much like the front, except that the mangy carpet was covered with heaps of paper and buff red, orange, green and blue folders. At least someone had made an effort to decorate the walls. They were hung with a huge collection of tomahawks, each one with a little card under it to tell you where it had come from and who it had been made by. Behind the desk, just visible through a haze of blue cigar smoke, Frank recognised Mr. Tanner at once. That was only to be expected. All through his early childhood he'd been told about him. Eat your nice dinner, tidy your room, be polite to the visitors, or Mr. Tanner will come and get you. And when, not unreasonably, he'd asked, "What's in Mr. Tanner, Mummy and Daddy?" they'd conjured up for him a mental image of a hunched, evil little man with curly salt and pepper hair, huge eyes magnified to disturbing size by massive glasses, wicked sharp teeth, a devilish grin, and plumes of smoke coming out of his nose. Young Frank Carpenter's plate was always polished clean and his bedroom immaculately tidy, until he reached the age when that sort of fortuitous threat no longer worked, and he'd come to assume that Mr. Tanner was about as real as the Tooth Fairy or the Easter Bunny. Apparently not. If anything, his parents' description had been an understatement. The little man lifted his head and glared at him. "Well," he said. "Dennis Tanner." "That's me," the little man said, in a strong Australian accent. "Who the hell are you?" "My name's Frank Carpenter. I believe you knew my..." "Oh, shit," Mr. Tanner said. "Now, hang on. That can't be right. Last time I saw Paul Carpenter and Sophie bloody Pettingale was only 3 years ago, and they sure as hell didn't have a kid. So..." An embarrassed grin slithered across Frank's face. "It's complicated," he said, "but yes, my mum and dad are Sophie and Paul Carpenter. They send their love, by the way," he added, "because if you climb too far up the moral high ground, there are avalanches and yetis." "Balls," said Mr. Tanner succinctly. "How's complicated?" "Very." Mr. Tanner sighed, gusting smoke in Frank's face. "Park your bum," he said reluctantly. "Curiosity's always been my downfall. Nah, scratch that. Your bloody mum and dad were my downfall. Curiosity's just one of my many nasty habits." He leaned forward across the desk, peering at Frank through his bulletproof glass-thick lenses. "Now you mention it,
there's definitely a resemblance. You got my great-great-granddad's chin, for one thing." He grinned, suddenly as a shark's jaws snapping shut. "Your dad mentioned that we're related, did he?"
Frank nodded. "Distant cousins," he said.
"That's right. You met my mum on the way in, of course."
"Oh, yes." Mr. Tanner leaned back in his chair.
"She was very keen on your dad at one time, my mum, which is the main reason I sent him to bloody New Zealand."
His eyes flared with fear and hate.
"He's not come back, has he?"
Frank shook his head.
"Still over there, then?"
Frank pursed his lips. "I did say it's complicated," he replied. "But as far as I know, he's got no plans to come to this country again, ever." Mr. Tanner sighed, from his boots up.
"Thank God for that," he said. "All right, I can start breathing again. So,"
he added, lighting a new cigar from the stub of the old one,
"tell me all about it."
There was no need to give Mr. Tanner the full version. He knew better than anyone how Paul Carpenter, Frank's father, had gone to work for J.W. Wells & Co., at that time the leading firm of sorcerers and magical practitioners in the city of London. How, once he'd found out what J.W. actually did, he'd originally assumed that they were in shipping or commodities or something. The only reason he'd stayed on was that he'd fallen in love with Sophie, the other junior clerk. How he'd accidentally come into possession of the Acme portable door, a wonderful but dangerous gadget that allowed you to travel anywhere in time and space just by unrolling it and pressing it against the nearest available flat vertical surface. How Paul had had the wretched bad luck to get locked in a life and death struggle with most of the firm's partners, one by one, and had incredibly prevailed, saving the human race and the fabric of the universe while he was at it, but ruining the firm's business in the process. None of that, Frank figured, was Mr. Tanner likely to have forgotten. Instead, he concentrated on what had happened after Paul and Sophie had retired to New Zealand, where they'd acquired, by way of murderously begrudged gift from JWW, the world's biggest and most profitable bauxite mine. For a while, Frank explained, they tried to live a normal, happy life, with nothing but each other and an unimaginable amount of money. After 29 years...
"Hold it,"
Mr. Tanner interrupted, with a bewildered expression on his face.
"That'd be 26 years into the future, right?"
Frank nodded. "Though from my perspective, of course, it's 3 years ago. Although,
do I look like I'm remotely interested in your bloody perspective?"
After 29 years of putting up with a lifestyle neither of them liked very much, but which they endured because they thought the other one liked that sort of thing, they came to a decision. Using the portable door one last time, they took a trip to a place and time that only the door could reach, waved an embarrassed and slightly weepy goodbye to their son, and told him to peel the door off the wall. It had, of course, been a traumatic parting, but Frank had managed to drag himself through it, ever so slightly buoyed up by the thought of inheriting the bauxite mine. It was only a few days later that he found out that one of his parents' last acts in this reality had been to make over the mine, the company, and their goose liver pate bloated bank account to the New Zealand Trust for Wildlife Conservation. It had been, the lawyer explained, his mother's idea. She knew how much Frank cared about the environment and our natural heritage. She was sure he'd be secretly pleased. Best kept secret in human history. After spending a month vainly trying to use the door to reach his parents' pocket reality, he gave up and considered his position as dispassionately as he could. He had no money, no home. The vast Carpenter mansion he'd grown up in was now the official residence of the chairman of trustees, whose first move on taking possession had been to grub up Sophie's 30-acre and aged orchid nursery and turn it into tennis courts, a golf course and a landing strip for his layered jet, and no means whatsoever of earning a living. On the positive side, he had a change of underwear, a pair of jeans, a lizard-headed women 2030 World Tour t-shirt, and the portable door. All in all, he decided, things could be worse. To start with, Frank went on, I set my sights quite low, materialising inside food stores and clothes shops at 2 a.m, that sort of thing. Not really my style, but... He frowned. Are you all right, Mr. Tanner? He asked. Mr. Tanner looked as though he'd tried to eat a whole cow in one bite.
Sorry, go on.
You're trying not to laugh, aren't you?
Me? No, get on with the story.
Well, the insurance thing had been just one of those bright ideas. It had come to him out of the blue while he'd been thinking about something else. At first he'd smiled and filed it away in the mental trash can marked "wouldn't be cool if." But materialising inside shops and helping yourself to merchandise for which you don't intend to pay is burglary, even if you used highly advanced magic instead of a jemmy, and that, Frank decided, was no way to live. He'd actually made a note of everything he'd taken and where it had come from in a little blue notebook, so that someday, when he had the money, he could make it all right again. But his conscience wasn't fooled that easily. The time had come, he realised with a sinking heart, for him to go out and get a job, or, at the very least, a profession, which is, after all, only a smart word for a job, but with longer hours, better money, and a helping of alphabet soup after your name on the printed letterhead. The time had come. Yeah, right, but he thought for someone with an Acme portable door, time is delightfully flexible. With the door, when he ran out of money, all he had to do was go back in time to a moment when he'd been loaded and spend it all over again. Or, better still, what about that crazy insurance idea? After all, it might just work, and if so... Simple, as the best ideas always are. Insurance companies, he figured, have to pay out huge sums of money whenever there's a disaster, and disasters often start off with some small, avoidable error of judgment. The Great Fire of London, for example, caused by the 17th century equivalent of a chip pan blaze. Someone with the hindsight of a retrospective hawk who could travel in time could go back to those crucial oh shit moments, prevent the error, and avert the disaster. The fire, explosion, meltdown, or multiple pile-up wouldn't happen. The insurance company wouldn't be called on to pay out. True, history would be violated, and a brick would be thrown through the brittle surface of reality, but in a good way, surely, because people who should have been killed or horribly mutilated would survive intact, wouldn't they? You'd have to be a really callous bastard or a government to find fault with that.
Your dog, Mr. Tanner interrupted, is eating the telephone flakes.
What?
Oh, God, sorry. Bobby, bad dog, leave it.
The dog lifted its head and gazed at him. Its deep brown eyes told him that it was hurt and very, very disappointed, but he forgave him. He looked around for something to throw at it.
It's all right, Mr. Tanner said. I don't mind. I like dogs.
Pause. 2, 3.
Couldn't manage a whole one, though.
The joke, Frank realised, lay in the uncertainty as to whether Mr. Tanner really was joking. Being a conscientious young man, Frank hadn't rushed into it. He'd thought it through. The drill was as follows. Having identified a disaster that he'd be able to prevent, some disasters had horribly complex causes, or were inevitable anyway, or preventing them would be dangerous, or just too much like hard work. He'd researched the lives of the victims to see if they were significant people or just walk-ons in life's pageant, and ran a simulation to find out how their unscheduled survival would affect the ebb and flow of history. To anybody else, that would have involved some extremely heavy maths. But Frank was descended on both sides from generations of ridiculously talented magicians, to the point where his genes practically glowed in the dark. Furthermore, his father had owned a small lump of rock crystal in which, if you got the lighting and the ambience exactly right, you could see all sorts of amazing stuff. He'd kept it hidden from Frank's mother, who didn't hoard with anything connected to their previous lives. A door trip back in time to retrieve it from under the loose floorboard in the attic 3 days before the wildlife people took possession of the house, and he had what he needed to run the simulations. He started small. There is a providence, he vaguely remembered reading somewhere, in the fall of a sparrow. Right on, as he proved with the door, the bit of crystal, and an air rifle. The simulation came out something like 87% accurate. If he hadn't shot it, the sparrow would have been eaten by the Macready's cat in any case, and the mother hatched the eggs perfectly well on her own. He felt bad about it for days, and he had a nasty feeling that his mother would have considered the experiment to be testing on animals and a mortal sin, but he couldn't bring himself to start fiddling about with the lives of human beings without some sort of trial run. Besides, his views on wildlife in general had changed ever so slightly after the chairman of trustees moved into the Carpenter house and turned his old bedroom into a karaoke studio. Then it was just a matter of establishing contact with Mr. Sprague. Actually, he rather liked the man. There was something endearing about the dogged, persevering way he tried to oil out of paying Frank his commission after every successful mission. Also, sometimes, when he knew Frank was coming, he laid on tea and biscuit. Only ever the one, a rich tea from his secretary's private packet. He explained that he was in business to make money, not spend it, and he had the shareholders to think of. Narrowing the focus of his amiability a little, Frank had realised that he liked Mr. Sprague because he was just about the only human being he'd met more than once since he'd embarked on his new career. This practically made him a father figure, although when you considered what Frank's real father had been like, maybe that wasn't such a good thing. "And he pays you money," Mr. Tanner said, after a long pause. Frank nodded. 10%, he replied. "And you've been doing this for how long?" Frank laughed. "That was supposed to be a trick question, right?" Mr. Tanner frowned. "What I meant was," he said, "you've done several jobs for this Sprague bloke." 47, Frank replied promptly, "assuming this is the 15th of June 2008. Of course, by this time yesterday, it could easily have been 106 or 23. It's complicated." Mr. Tanner scowled at him. "I'll say this for you," he said. "You're your father's son, all right, and your mother's too, of course. But that's not quite so bad. I mean, yeah, she was a total menace. And if I had that door thing of yours, the first thing I'd do would be to nuke her in her cot. But you're dead." He shuddered and grinned. "What made your dad so very fucking special was the way he trashed the lives of everybody he came in contact with and screwed up the fabric of time and space while always doing the right thing, if you see what I'm getting at. What I'm saying is, you'd go over it afterward and think it all through, and yes, anyone with a shred of human decency would have done exactly the same as he did in those particular circumstances. Absolutely no two ways about it, even though the consequences was pure bloody hell for everybody involved. The choice had to be made, and he made it. It's just, he kept on, and on, and on, getting stuck with that kind of choice. It's like the intolerable moral dilemmas homed in on him through vast distances. And if just once the choice had been up to a selfish, greedy, unprincipled little bastard like me..." He shook his head. There was a miniature snowstorm of dandruff. "But there you go. Runs in the family, suppose." "Sorry, I don't..." "Typical bloody Carpenter mentality," Mr. Tanner barked, jabbing with his cigar. "You go round playing cat's cradle with the lives of everybody on the planet, but it's all okay because you're saving people's lives. And yes, there could be problems as a result, but you've got your little bit of rock that tells you it'll all be fine. So, you know what? That's just not stupid. It's special, rare, kind of stupidity that's so crass it's practically liberal Democrat. And one of these days, when it all hits the fan," he shrugged, "I'd kill you if I thought I could get away with it, but there you go. Enough of that. So, what do I owe this unwanted pleasure?" Frank didn't answer straight away. He was hurt. Sure, he'd expected a certain degree of hostility, but this was more than he'd bargained for. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't think you'd see it that way." "You didn't?" "No. Figures." Frank sighed. "I only came here to give you some money." Mr. Tanner froze. Misleading term in context. Rather, it was as though someone had pressed the pause button and stopped the world for a moment. "Money?" Frank nodded. "I figured that, well, it was partly my parents' fault that you lost the business and everything you'd worked so hard for all your life, and it didn't really seem very fair to me, and I've been doing quite well at this insurance thing I've been telling you about, and to be honest with you, I don't really need all that money. It's not like I've got very much to spend it on, and if I did, all I've got to do is go out and earn some more. So I thought..." He hesitated. This was embarrassing. Would 10 million be any good? Mr. Tanner's lips shaped the words 10 million, but no sound came out. "Dollars," Frank amplified. "Pounds." "All right, pounds. Would that sort of help you get back on your feet, making your life for yourself, that sort of thing?" Mr. Tanner was thinking, yup, he's a carpenter all right. Bit like what you'd get if you took an atomic bomb and brought it up to be a devout Quaker. Sooner or later you'd get melted pavements and silhouettes on the walls, but it had all been with the very best of intentions. "Yes," Mr. Tanner said, and then he added, "It'd be a start, anyway." Frank frowned. "A start?" Mr. Tanner nodded, several times. "A gesture. It's the thought that counts." Frank took out his checkbook. opened it, patted his top pocket.
"Excuse me, you got a pen?"
Mr. Tanner gave him one. It was a plain black biro with extreme tooth marks where someone had been chewing it.
"Sorry, what's the date today?"
Mr. Tanner pointed to the desk calendar.
"Ah, right," Frank said. "Only a loose trick. Will just D. Tanner be all right, or—" "That'll do fine."
Tearing noise. The top left-hand corner had come off, the way it does if you don't tug at it just right. Frank handed the cheque to Mr. Tanner, who studied it carefully for a moment, then laid it on his desk and weighed it down with a heavy, old-fashioned stapler.
"My pen,"
he said.
"Sorry, can I have my pen back, please?" "Oh, right, not to worry,"
Mr. Tanner said, taking the pen from Frank and putting it away in a drawer.
"Easily done.
He paused, and a battle seemed to be taking place behind his eyes.
"Want a receipt?"
"What? Oh, no, don't bother about that." It was as though an invisible dentist was pulling all Mr. Tanner's teeth.
"Thanks,"
he grunted, then swallowed.
"Yes, well, thank you."
Frank smiled.
"My pleasure,"
he said.
"Only it's sort of been on my mind a bit lately, and—"
Mr. Tanner had noticed something. He moved the stapler an inch to the left and glanced down.
"I see you bank with—"
"That's right," Frank said, pleased that the subject had changed. "Dad always thought very highly of them, and I don't know about finance and stuff, so when I wanted to open a bank account, I just kind of took his advice. He said you used to bank with them back in the old days." Mr. Tanner grunted.
"Yes,"
he said.
"Can't say I ever liked them much myself. Good deposit rates, mind, and their charges aren't bad. But I didn't think they did private accounts, just businesses and so on."
"It was sort of a favour. Dad told me the chief cashier was an old friend." Well then, Frank thought, I've done what I came to do, and clearly he doesn't like me very much. I had better go. He stayed. So, he said awkwardly, "You still, in the trade?"
"It's the only thing I know,"
Mr. Tanner replied.
"And it's a living, not like the old days, of course. We had a pretty good client portfolio at JWW and a good team, even if they were all bastards of one kind or another. We used to make some serious money. Before my parents buggered it all up, yes. Oh, don't look at me like that. You think it's just me bearing a grudge? Fine. Well, when your mum and dad joined the firm, there were 7 partners. Let's see now. Your dad killed Ricky and Theo. He locked Judy up in the Isle of Avalon. Bad place, that. You really don't want to know about it. And yes, he turned Humph Wells into a photocopier, which was probably the nastiest trick of all, because you know what people do in offices to photocopiers. Oh, and if your dog chews up the VAT returns, I'm going to turn it into an egg and jump on it, even if you did just give me 10 million quid. What? Oh, Christ, Bobby! So you see," Mr. Tanner went on. He was smirking now and seemed rather more relaxed, maybe because he'd felt he got the moral high ground back. "It wasn't just a clash of personalities or nasty bosses bullying the poor downtrodden workers. He ruined me. Couldn't have done otherwise, like I said, him being a fundamentally decent human being. But, that really doesn't make it any better somehow. We had to sell the business in the end. Jack Wells retired, Kaz Sustovich went a bit funny, and as far as I know, he's working in local government somewhere. Connie Schwartz Alberish, did your father ever mention her?"
"No."
"After his time, probably." Frank shrugged. "Screw her then. As for me, well, you can see where I ended up. Not exactly where I'd have expected to be in 5 years' time, as they say in the motivational interviews." He sighed. "But there we go. Life and all that stuff."
Frank hesitated. He felt very sorry for Mr. Tanner, but he couldn't help remembering that this was the man who terrorised his parents, leaving them scarred for life. It didn't seem so bad, but maybe suffering had mellowed him, or at least drained away his strength. "Well," he said briskly, "money'll help, won't it?"
"Money? The 10 million.
Mr. Tanner went quiet for a moment.
"It's not quite as simple as that. For one thing, I've got debts from the old days."
"Ah."
"I've owed my landlords, for one thing."
Frank frowned. "Dad told me you leased a building from your mother's family."
"That's right. Surely they'd understand about—" Mr. Tanner laughed. "Did your dad tell you about my family?" "Our family?"
Well, he said your mother's very friendly, outgoing sort of—"
You leave my mother out of this. He's her son's godfather, isn't he?
Her other son, he said immediately, wishing he hadn't.
That's right.
Mr. Tanner's eyes had grown small and sharp.
Little Paul Azog, my half-brother.
Azog, Frank repeated. That's a Russian name, isn't it? Mr. Tanner grinned.
Not quite, he said. Actually, it's Goblin.
A smile flashed across Mr. Tanner's face.
That's what our family is. Mum's side. Your dad didn't tell you that, did he?
The smile was so broad that it crinkled the corners of Mr. Tanner's eyes.
Goblins, he repeated. Little hairy buggers with great big claws and teeth, live in holes in the ground, and they eat people. Goblins, on my mother's side,
Mr. Tanner said.
My dad's family are from Adelaide.
Right, Frank breathed in deeply. Well, he said in a rather subdued voice, I have to say that does come as a bit of a...
Could be worse,
Mr. Tanner said. Really?
Too right. Could have been from Sydney. So, now you know. And yes, the money will come in handy to pay off a bit of the back rent. Maybe now my Uncle Bolg and my Auntie Frida won't come after me one dark night and tear out my ribcage with their fingers. Wet off my mind that. No, you can never tell with family. I'm just grateful it was Mum's side I pissed off. Dad's looked like a real load of bastards.
But, he went on, if you think for one moment that it makes us all square, no hard feelings, cards at Christmas, and why don't we ask Cousin Dennis around for a barbie on the lawn, forget it, not going to happen. Frank bit his lip. A substantial part of his brain was still processing the goblin thing. What was left floundered in a pool of well-meaning guilt. I'm sorry you feel that way, he said. If there's ever anything I can do... Actually, Mr. Tanner leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. Actually, he said, there is. Really? Sure. Mr. Tanner nodded. Piece of cake for you. As a matter of fact, right up your alley. All you need to do is go back through that door of yours the day your old man was born and cut his throat. Better still, save you all the mess and bother. Go back a bit further and make sure his dad never met his mum. Or they had a bloody great row or something. Then your dad wouldn't have ever happened. I'd still be a partner at DWW and you wouldn't flaming well exist. He grinned cheerfully. I don't call that a lot to ask, do you? And like I said, we're family. I don't really think I could do that, Frank said in a very small voice. It'd be, well, doing the right thing if you ask me. I expect your dad to see it that way. Yes, Frank said, but I'm not him. Besides, he added, that really would upset the fabric of reality and all that stuff. You said yourself, Dad saved the human race and things like that. If he hadn't... Mr. Tanner waved his hand. It's all right, he said. I didn't expect you'd agree. That's the thing about having a really low opinion of human nature. You're never disappointed. Nah, you bugger off and enjoy yourself. Don't worry about me. I'll get by somehow, always have. And you told me yourself, you only prevent disasters and right wrongs if you're getting paid. Wouldn't want you working for free. That's not how we do things in the business. Talking of which, he added with a yawn, you may have all the time in the world, but I haven't. So unless there's anything else you want to talk about... No, that's... Frank stood up. It was, Likewise, said Mr. Tanner, meeting you. And I really am very sorry about all the fuss, And if ever there's anything else I can do, look, here's how you can get hold of me. He took a card out of his pocket. Mr. Tanner made no effort to take it, so Frank put it on the desk. Just leave a message with Mrs. O'Brien. He seemed to have run out of words. Well, cheers then. I'll go now. His hand was on the door handle when Mr. Tanner said, just one other thing. He turned around quickly. Yes? You've forgotten your dog. Ah, right. Frank sighed. Come on, Bobby. Here, boy. Oh, you stupid animal. 3 seconds of dead silence. Then Mr. Tanner said, don't worry about it. They need replacing anyway. I'll just have to keep the window open for a day or two. The nastiest thing that anybody had ever done to his parents, Frank reflected as he left Mr. Tanner's office, had been meant as an act of kindness. Typical. It'd been the sort of present men would die for. Quite a few had over the years, but its only effect, apart from what it said on the tin, had been to make Mum and Dad utterly miserable. In fact, it had probably been the final straw that had prompted them to wall themselves up in their own separate and unreachable tangent of space-time. Good intentions, Mr. Tanner had said. Well, quite. The 6-lane superhighway to hell is paved, tarmacked, cat-side, signposted, streetlit, hard shoulders, and contrafloored with good intentions. As a carpenter, he didn't need some goblin to tell him that. Goblins, he thought. Goblins. It had been a Christmas present from Uncle Benny, the only one of his dad's old work colleagues who'd kept in touch. He only remembered him vaguely as a short, terrifying man with a doormat beard, thick spectacles, and a strange laugh. Dad had tried to tell him the backstory once, something about how Uncle Benny had helped him save Mum from the Queen of the Fae, whoever the hell she was. Dad tried to explain, but he tuned out. He'd only been 6 at the time. Uncle Benny used to visit them for a while after he'd retired from the trade, but then he'd given them the present, and after that they made it clear in their kind, tactful, extremely offensive way that he wasn't welcome in their house any more. What he'd given them, gruff, kind-hearted, stupid Uncle Benny, was the gift of eternal youth. It had come in a cardboard box, Frank remembered, like the ones they package computer programs in. There were instructions inside, in 7 languages, and a small brown bottle of pills. Mum and Dad had taken 2 each. After Mum had read the label carefully to make sure they didn't contain synthetic additives or GM ingredients, and that was that. Irreversible, the leaflet said. The problem was, Mum and Dad had never quite mastered the knack of being young. Youth hadn't fitted them. Too tight in some places, baggy in others, and the sleeves came down to their knuckles. They knew it was something you were supposed to enjoy, a taste you were practically obliged to acquire, like alcohol or extra mature cheese, and they'd done their conscientious best. But they'd failed. Both of them. Middle age suited them so much better. It had calmed them down, created a demilitarized zone in the middle of their frantic, hair-trigger relationship, in which all the little misunderstandings and presumed slights and routine acts of thoughtlessness didn't really matter all that terribly much. Making them both 17 again, forever and ever and ever, was probably the cruelest thing anybody could have done to them. Silly Uncle Benny. Frank hadn't mentioned any of that to Mr. Tanner, though he was sure he'd have been interested. On reflection, that was short-sighted. Mr. Tanner was, after all, the first real-life magician he'd ever met, apart from Mum and Dad, of course, who didn't count. As such, he presumably knew about stuff like eternal youth tablets. He'd know if they really were irreversible, and if so, whether there was some other stuff you could take that could override the effects. Frank had his doubts about that. Most likely, he reckoned, it'd be harder to get R&D funding for an elixir of eternal middle age. The point was, Mr. Tanner would know if anybody did. If there wasn't one, maybe he could invent it. In return for money, of course, but that at least wouldn't be a problem. If he really could come up with something, some miracle cure that'd make the real world bearable again for his poor abused parents, well, there was still the small matter of finding them, in a place where even the portable door couldn't go. One step at a time. He looked both ways and crossed the road. Of course, if he did hire Mr. Tanner, it might be an idea not to mention to him that it was Mum and Dad he wanted the stuff for. However strong and motivated money might be, Frank had a suspicion that it might not get the job done in this particular case. Always assuming, of course, that Mr. Tanner would agree to see him again. There was definitely a bit of unresolved hostility there, not to mention what Bobby had done to his phone cables. Goblins, he thought. Goblins. Quick look over his shoulder, and then he slid the door out of its tube, held it up against the hoarding, smoothed out the wrinkles with a practised sweep of his hand, and turned the doorknob. He winced as he stepped through, because it was raining on the other side. It always rained there. Back home. Can the word home possibly have any meaning to someone with a portable door? Frank had reservations about that too. The door changed everything, or at least it turned all the straight lines and edges to jelly. He always went back to these precise coordinates in time and space, in spite of the horrible clammy rain, so presumably it was his home. Strange place to pick, strange moment. He had no idea why he'd chosen it. As he pulled the door to after him, he heard a shrill yap. He sighed. "Come on in, if you're coming," he said wearily, and the dog hopped in over his feet, cringed as the raindrops hit the top of its head. He slammed the door and put it away. On the other side, where a builder's hoarding had suddenly reverted to being blank and featureless, something moved in the gutter. At first it was no more than a trick of the light, or, properly speaking, its absence. Movement defined it, turning it from a vague black blur into a recognisable shape. The two-dimensional silhouette of a dog, complete with frantically wagging tail. After a moment it sat, sideways of course, since it couldn't do up, and its raised head and eloquently expressive nose pointed at the place on the hoarding where the illusion of a door had briefly been. It waited, but the door didn't come back. The shape of a front paw stretched like bubblegum across the pavement, met the wall and bent at right angles, grotesquely extended, carrying up the hoarding to where the knob had been. It dabbed at the spot, but there wasn't anything there. The shadow of a dog can't whimper, so it didn't. The paw's shape retreated to the position it had started from. The shadow sat, alert and at attention, like a negative of the HMV symbol. As the hours wore on, it moved a little, but only because the angle of the sun changed. It had no mind of its own, needless to say, even less of one than the animal in whose image it had been formed, but the shape knew how to sit, because it had been trained. On some level, so obscure and complex that even the most brilliant quantum physicist couldn't begin to describe it, the shape vaguely remembered that there was a connection between sitting and little bits of chopped-up liver. Concepts of loyalty and patience have no relevance in the context of a patch of concrete where photons can't reach because there's something in the way. Even so, there's a fair chance that it'd be there yet if the shadow of a woman hadn't strolled horizontally towards it, whistled, and said, "Here, boy." Who could that shadow of a woman possibly be? Well. So, yes, please excuse my Dennis Tanner accent. It's not my strongest suit, but I do try my very best for you guys, so let's just roll with it as best we can. Right, so, okay, chapter 3 is going to come in a couple of days. I'm trying to keep up the pace of a chapter every couple of days, and I hope we can do books 6 and 7 as well to complete the series. But as you know, I will always do my very best to complete an audiobook, and I always love having you here. You're very much appreciated, and I do like our little group. I said do. God. But you know what? I'm not AI. I don't create things with AI, so I'm just going to leave this as it is with mistakes in and all that jazz. So I hope that's okay with you and that you do enjoy it. But from what the comments you've been leaving, I can see that you are, and that means everything. Anyway, time for a cuppa, so I can go and rest my voice, but I will be back in a couple of days, so if you can hit the like button, let me know if you've enjoyed it. Leave me any comments if you think there's anything I can do better, or if I need to change, or just to say hello, and let me know how you are. Most of all, stay safe. I'll see you in a couple of days, and take it easy, petal. See you soon.